Okay, great. I think we'll kick off. Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for the Q2 quarterly webinar. My name's Chris and I'm on the engagement team here at Planet Tracker. So over the next 20 to 30 minutes or so, we'll dive into our latest work on transition risk for investors in crop protection and fertilizer companies. We'll then look at the chemical sector and their decarbonisation efforts. And finally, we'll get a snapshot of some additional future work on chemicals that Plant Tracker is working on. Um, with me are my colleagues Richard and Jon to discuss these topics. Now, just a quick point that some of you may have been expecting us to discuss some of our work on traceability in the seafood sector. So that was initially the plan, but unfortunately this has been moved and has been pushed back to our Q3 update. So if you did join for that, I do apologize. We will be discussing that later on in the year. So some quick housekeeping before we start. So if you have any questions, please add them into the Q&A. We'll try and pick them up here, but if not, we'll get back to you after the webinar. And lastly, we are recording this webinar and we'll be uploading onto YouTube and sharing later. So before we kick off, I just wanted to take a minute to introduce Planet Tracker to those of you who aren't familiar with our work. So Planet Tracker is a sustainable finance think tank conducting research on nature-related risks and opportunities. Now we focus on the drivers of biodiversity loss, specifically land and sea use change, exploitation of natural resources, pollution, and climate change. We provide in-depth research reports on each of these topics, covering a range of industries and themes, as you can see on the slide here. So with that being said, I will dive into the webinar, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Richard to discuss our report, Food for Thought. Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and afternoon, good morning to everyone. As Chris mentioned, I'm going to talk about our report, Food for Thought. Now, Food for Thought compares the climate transition progress of Yara, Syngenta Group, Corteva, Nutrien, and Mosaic. Next slide, please. So the issue is that agriculture is an important source of greenhouse gas emissions. For instance, it's estimated to generate around 40% of global emissions of the potent greenhouse gas methane, more than produced by fossil fuels. And I would say that if you're interested in agricultural methane, I'd put you to our website for a recent series of reports, including Methane Matters, Silence of the Loans, and Materially Neglected. But more specific to the companies covered in our Food for Thought report, synthetic fertiliser production and use is estimated to be responsible for approximately 5% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. Thus, changes by corporates active in the agricultural sector are important drivers of overall global emission reduction and what we hope to achieve. And in our view, investors have a key role in holding management teams to account for setting their climate targets and monitoring the progress they display against those targets. Our climate transition analysis work aims to provide investors with the ability to assess transition leaders and laggards using a structured, evidence-based framework, which we are expanding to cover more and more sectors. They can then use the relative standings of the corporates analysed to assess how they are exposed to reputational or regulatory risk related to their climate transition progress. And Planet Tracker has published a series of company-specific climate transition and analysis deep dives, along with summary reports across sectors, including chemicals, you'll hear some more on that later, advertising and FMCG names. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, Food for Thought examined each of Corteva, Nutrien, Syngenta Group, Mosaic, and Yara. Although all are active in the agricultural sector, the companies range from those focusing on fertiliser production to those manufacturing crop protection products. We examined them along a number of different metrics, including their emissions history and the trajectory implied by their recent emissions progress, policy and engagement, governance, risk management, and capital allocation. On this slide, we summarise our findings for each area, assigning the corporates as either leading, performing, or lagging across each of these areas. We note that rating a company as leading is not to say its performance in that area is perfect. Across all the areas we looked at, corporates could do better in terms of transparency and delivery. So what were our key takeaways? Now, firstly, we found that Yara was the leader in two areas. We welcomed its setting of absolute reduction targets across scopes and noted its recent history of good progress in containing emissions. On its transition strategy, we welcome the detail Yara provides on its climate transition CapEx plans. Secondly, we found all the companies have much more to do on value chain engagement. which is a critical part of a credible transition plan, as I'll discuss further in a moment. And in general, the companies need to provide more detail on the strategies they're going to employ to reduce emissions in the future and the costs this will involve. Alongside this, we call for better reporting of their own internal assessments of the risks and opportunities that come with climate change. Next slide, please. Now, one recurring issue across the areas we analysed was the Scope 3 footprint of these companies. Firstly, not all of them report Scope 3 emissions, which is an obvious area where greater transparency is desperately needed. Reporting Scope 3 should be a first step for Syngenta Group and Nutrien. Where Scope 3 emissions are reported, they're typically more than 70% of the total emissions footprint, underlining why addressing this area is so critical. As an example of how failing to address Scope 3 could undermine any emissions reduction plan, a simple extrapolation of recent emission trajectory for Mosaic suggests it will see its overall emissions balloon by 83% by 2030 due to recent rises in its Scope 3 footprint. This compares, for instance, with Yara, who would see their emissions fall 24% because they've seen falls across all scopes in recent times. However, as I noted on the previous slide, all the corporates are lagging behind on engaging with and working with their value chains to address Scope 3 emissions. Without a strategy to address value chain emissions, it's highly questionable how the companies can hope to deliver a true climate transition aligned business in the future. We also note that where corporates do have targets for emissions reduction, there's a trend towards using intensity-based rather than absolute targets. This risks overall emissions rising even if the corporates deliver the target. We favour absolute reduction targets which encompass scopes 1, 2 and 3. Next slide, please. So what are our recommendations? We'd encourage investors to engage with corporates on their transition plans. We'd urge them to differentiate between those corporates who are leading on climate and those who are lagging behind. They should be looking for firms with clear, quantified reporting of their emissions and absolute reduction targets and credible strategies for delivery of those targets. We call for investors to ensure management incentives are aligned with delivering on the climate transition. This should be associated with Scope 3 reduction target setting and clear strategies for working with their value chain to deliver these targets. This should ideally include detail of the investment needed and timelines for delivery. Our report is available on our website, and with that, I will hand back to Chris. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard. And just a very quick question for you. So what would you say some of the things that these companies could be doing to reduce their emissions?
That's a good question. And I think first up, I should say that it isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. We also wouldn't want to be seen as being really prescriptive on solutions and would always acknowledge that corporates are best placed to understand their own businesses. We think investors should be asking management to set out their strategies, explain the costs, explain timelines, and show what evidence there is that they will deliver on the targets they're setting. So are they relying on technologies which have yet to be proven at scale, such as carbon capture and storage? What might that mean in terms of, a failure to deliver if those technologies don't actually work? Saying that, there are a few examples we probably would pick out as something we would like to see corporates doing in their own operations, obviously electrification and the use of renewable energy, moving away from natural gas as a fuel or raw material. With the value chain, which I noted is such a critical area, there's still a long way to go, but we'd like to see them working with customers to help them utilize products in a smart way, if I can put it that way. That's ensuring the product is used at the right time, in the right way, and in the right amount, so that waste is avoided and unnecessary emissions avoided. But to reiterate again, Scope 3 is the area where there is furthest to go. It's where the most probably R&D needs to be spent, and it's going to take a concerted effort from management teams and corporates to deliver emission reduction.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Richard. I see there's a couple of questions for you in the Q&A box, so feel free to answer them. That'd be great. Thank you very much. Okay, excellent. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Jon, who will discuss our work on decarbonising chemicals. Jon, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Richard. So now I'll be broadening the discussion to the chemical industry as a whole. More specifically, the Decarbonizing Chemicals paper compares the climate transition plans of 8 major chemical producers, as you can see on the slide. and we assess not only their emission targets, but also whether those targets are supported by credible governance, the capital allocation these companies have in place, the risk management, and also the implementation of their transition plans. If you can move to the next slide, I would highlight that the issue here would be central to the fact that the chemical industry produces many of the building blocks of modern life. So their importance would move beyond its own emissions. For instance, the chemicals ability to transition also affects the ability of sectors such as construction, transport, agriculture, as Richard was mentioning while covering the fertilizers companies, and also consumer goods, and of course materials. So our central finding is that the sector overall is not yet fully aligned with the Paris goal, and we did also find a wide variation between the companies. So it shows that greater ambition and meaningful emission reductions are feasible, but the sector cannot yet explain that through its weak transition plans. So the real question, therefore, is not whether the chemical companies can transition, but why some are moving faster than others, if you will. So if we move to the next slide to get more in depth into our findings, we would divide these 8 companies into 3 broad groups. So at the front, we found Dyno Nobel, Incitec Pivot, the only company to be aligned with a very ambitious 1.5-degree pathway, and is mainly because its operational emissions declined by 39% against its restated 2020 baseline, and it allows to exceed its original 2030 targets a few years earlier. Also, they targeted nitrous oxide abatement with projects that delivered around 750 kilotons of annual emission reductions. And this demonstrates that high impact projects can produce measurable results. Also at the top, we'll find LyondellBasell with below 2 degrees alignment and one of the most ambitious combined target in our sample with 42% reduction in scope 1 and 2 and 30% reduction in scope 3 emissions by 2030. However, their emissions have moved recently what you would call the wrong direction. So of course, this alignment remains dependent on the delivery of the plans they have. Going down the ladder, we will find the likes of Air Liquide, BASF, Bayer, and Toray from this 2-degree cluster. So, you know, it could be 2.1, 2.4, but it's just that sort of that range where we have some operational progress, but each of these companies do have significant limitations, particularly around scope 3 emissions, and most importantly, around the ability to connect transition investment with measurable carbon reductions, which we do believe at Planet Tracker that is something that investors should ask more details on. On the other end, you will have Dow and SABIC, which we would say they are on a 3-degree pathway alignment, mainly because their operational targets are relatively modest, and neither of them have scope 3 reduction strategies in place. But also in the last couple of years, we've seen degree of return on or going back on the amount of disclosures that they publish when it comes to their climate transition. So with that in mind, we'll move to the next slide to highlight what are the three key gaps that hold the sector back. So first of all, it would be scope 3. So for 7 out of the 8 companies, with the exception of Air Liquide, the value chain emission, so scope 3 represent between 70 and 84% of their total footprint. And yet most of these companies have either no quantified scope 3 targets or some targets that only cover part of the scope 3 categories. So this means that the companies can report some progress on operation emissions, but they still leave most of its climate impact outside of their transition plan, something that one way or another should be addressed. The second gap, as I was mentioning on the previous slide, is the capital to carbon traceability. So several companies announced investments in hydrogen, renewable electricity, recycling, and other transition technologies, but none consistently tell investors how many tons of emissions would be avoided by the projects they have or the amount of capital they invest, even if it's just a range, because as they might argue, it's not concrete science. But without that connection, investors cannot determine whether transition expenditure is sufficient, it's efficiently allocated, or able to deliver the required reductions set by the targets. And lastly, but not least importance, the third gap would be governance, because here climate indicators are increasingly included in the executive remuneration, but they remain generally a relative small part of the total pay, and often they are included in a broader catalog of sustainability measures, which doesn't make very clear what are the incentives behind the company achieving their transition plans. For instance, SABIC also presents a disclosure warning. So while its emissions, carbon emissions, scope 3 fell from 122 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2020, there is no reported data in 2024. So there is this sort of, yes, we reduced, but we sort of are not very transparent on how much. So again, that shows a lack of clarity on disclosure. If we move to the next slide, when it comes to the investor engagement priorities, our findings point to 4 priorities for investors. First, they should demand comprehensive scope 3 targets, our intensity targets that can improve while total emissions continue to maintain the level as production grows. Second, companies should provide project-related capital to carbon disclosures, or as I was saying, a range of how capital is being deployed and what emissions it aims to achieve, what technology supports that reduction, and so on. Third, when it comes to climate performance, it should become materially consequential for executive remuneration. So there should be more clarity into when and how the management gets remunerated in achieving these targets. And finally, investors should treat declining transparency as a red flag rather than simply an absence of information. As I was saying, companies saying, well, we reduce emissions from this huge number, but then do not clarify by how much, or simply the whole sort of scope 3 emissions suddenly not being reported, does become a potential risk going forward. Yes, so take it together, these measures would help investor distinguish between a net zero ambition and a deliverable transition strategy. So again, a target is not a plan. A plan does need to be supported by initiatives and the capex behind it. if we move to the next slide, you will be able to well, I'll talk about next research, but also if you have any questions at this point, please let Chris know, and we'll be able to answer them. Chris, I don't know if you want to add anything at this point before I move on to talking briefly about the future work on chemicals.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I guess a quick question. So if investors could focus on just one indicator to distinguish sort of a credible chemical sector transition plan from an aspirational net zero commitment, what would you say it should be?
Sure, I would say that it goes back to what investors should care more about, which is whether the company can connect its emission targets to its capital allocation, right? So a target does tell investors where the company wants to go, but capital allocation, it actually shows whether it's actually building the pathway to eventually get there, right? So I would say companies should identify and disclose the projects delivering the reductions, disclose the capital committed for a certain range of emissions they want to reduce. And again, it is about becoming more transparent and actually showing that they are putting the money where the target is. So I would say it is the stronger indicator, and it is the only way to trace real progress, because sometimes, as many will argue, emission reduction is not a linear path. So as long as you do have the supporting evidence that despite emissions having increased recently, that they could, based on your investment, be reduced in the future years, that is a good sign, and something that definitely distinguishes a credible climate plan from just an ambitious target.
Great. Thanks very much, Sean. And I see we do have two questions in the chat in the Q&A box, but I think we'll get back to them after the webinar so you can present on this future work we have.
Sure. So I will speak briefly about the future research before going back to the chat questions. So if you can have the next slide, Chris. Perfect. 1 second, because I lost my slides here. Okay. So looking ahead, we've seen that there is quite a lot of interest into geolocating the potential climate-related physical risks, also the implications on nature. So one of the thought leadership pieces that we will be releasing soon would be to assess for a broader range of chemical companies, the top 24 of them by revenue on average, what would be their water risk based on their geolocated facilities. Bear in mind, we are unable to pinpoint to the all facilities of the companies, but we will give a good range of the biggest facilities, what water risk they are subject to, and what is potentially the asset value that is at risk because of those nature, more specifically water risks we identify. We use well-known sort of risk assessment tools. Most of the data, it comes from the Aqueduct database, and then we were able to ourselves to find the location of some of the biggest facilities that these key chemical companies have. So definitely, keep an eye out for that. And now, if I'm going back to the chat questions really quickly, so one of the questions is, if a company has been downgraded from 2 to 3 degrees, does that reflect anywhere else? Mainly, you ask CDP or no longer a signatory of an organization such as PRI or Net Zero Asset Management. I would say CDP should drop the rating if the amount of disclosure doesn't complete all the form that the CDP presents them. Mainly because, as I was saying, you have a lot of companies that they might be ranked on the climate disclosure with an A, so one of the best rankings, but that doesn't mean actually that the company is on track for the Paris Agreement target. It just means that it has really good disclosures. So basically it answers all the CDP questions. So that's where our assessment takes the analysis a bit further and looks into, okay, you do have the information, but how does that align with what you actually should be doing? So it might have a decrease in the CDP ranking, or it might not, depending if the disclosure per se is affected. In SABIC's case, I think it should, but we don't know because don't have access to the CDP database. Same for other signatories organizations such as PRI and others. But definitely, I think it should be reported also somewhere else. And we do collaborate with other organizations. So we do have constant chats with Share Actions, IAGCC, even UNPRI, and we update them on our findings. So it is a collaborative environment. Last question, declining transparency as a red flag. It is interesting. And we do hope that, yes, it will reverse. But I would say that also we do try to keep it as comparable as possible. So sometimes, new policies that affects only one company might be not taken into consideration immediately, because we do apply a standardized assessment framework and try to make the analysis as comparable as possible between the companies. So sometimes there might be certain policies or certain ratios specific to a company that we may not include, as I was saying, in the ambitions of keeping everything comparable. So that would be all from my side. Thank you all for attending our Q&A. And again, if you have any other questions left, please feel free to email us and we will get back to you. Have a nice rest of the day.